I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, a lot of talk about car fires on board ships, and particularly involving electrical vehicles. We just had a very dramatic one out in the Pacific with the morning Midas. I want to talk about it today. So, we're going to do our segment we do here on what's going on with shipping, where I bring in an expert to have a discussion on a segment we like to call Between Two Sterns. And I couldn't think of anybody better to bring on than my buddy Patrick Durham over from StacheD Training. Patrick, good morning. How are we doing, bud?
Hey, good morning. I'm doing well. Yourself?
I am great, man. Listen, I appreciate you coming on. We had a little bit of an issue about getting you on. It was my fault, but our schedules have now worked out perfectly. And let it be clear, Patrick, you're the best person I think I can get on here to talk about this because you are an expert, a fire eater of epic proportions. So why don't you do us all a great service and introduce yourself, and then we're going to jump into our discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. Patrick Durham. I'm currently a captain at a fire department here in Michigan. I've been a firefighter for almost 20 years. It's coming up pretty quick on 20 years, but I'm also a mechanical engineer. So the fire side is all volunteer. On the engineering side, I've been a mechanical engineer for about 20 years as well. The last 14, 15 years, I've worked in the auto industry in some type of advanced development role. And like 2018, I started working on electric vehicles and doing research and development on the battery box structure for electric vehicles. So that's kind of what brought me into this role today, being on YouTube, doing training and consulting around electric vehicles and lithium ion batteries.
Yeah, and you do a great job. I've recommended you multiple times. We have talked on a batch of issues that have happened. So, and we both share that volunteer firefighting experience. So it's a great one for both of us. So let's talk a little bit about this. We've had a decision by Matson Shipping to no longer haul electrical vehicles. That's prompting this story today. But before we jump into that, let's take a kind of step back, and I really want to get your expertise on this. Now, why do EVs, electrical vehicles, pose such a unique risk, especially for firefighters and firefighting?
The biggest difficulty is the batteries themselves because they're under the vehicle, because there's so much energy stored under that vehicle. And the batteries, when they get angry, when they go into thermal runaway, there's just really no stopping it. And it releases a lot of energy in a very short amount of time.
I think it's the energy aspect about it. I think you're exactly right about that. It's also it also creates other unique problems with gases that are emitting from it. They're self-sustaining. I mean, we have a lot of issues for it, and that comes to the fire extinguishing aspect by it. I've been to a few electrical vehicle fires, and they are remarkably different than an internal combustion engine fire. What would you, how would you qualify like the big difference between those two styles of firefighting when you have to deal with an internal combustion engine and ICE versus an electrical vehicle and EV?
Internal combustion engine fires are pretty easy. They're, I would say, bread and butter. We firefighters enjoy going to a vehicle fire just because you get some action and it's over very quickly. Not a lot of effort goes into it. From the time you leave the firehouse to the time you get back to the firehouse, you're talking maybe 30 minutes, 500 gallons of water. On the flip side, an electric vehicle, they're just really stubborn because when those batteries go into thermal runaway, again, you can't really get to them. They're releasing a lot of hazardous gas, explosive gases as well. And that is really relevant when you start talking about shipboard firefighting because you're building up a very explosive rich, flammable rich atmosphere. But the fire is just, it's really stubborn. The heat release rate is different. So it's releasing a lot of heat early on in the incident, and it can cause that fire to jump from vehicle to vehicle. Again, going back to the ship side of things, if things are really close. So they're just really difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you. Firefighters do love a good car fire. It sounds weird of saying this, but people
It
need to
does.
understand. If we're gonna get paid now for a call, there are different styles of calls. Car fires are great too because I mean it's like one hose, you're jump line off the front of the hose. It's an easy cleanup, and like you said, you're there. But my experience with EV fires is, you said they burn forever. I mean, it just you could dump you could dump an ocean on them, and they're gonna keep burning on you. And we're fortunate usually because when we deal with EV fires out in on land, they're usually away from an exposure. They're on a road or a highway, or they're involved in an accident of some kind. The problem we have is on that shipboard firefighting side, because the shipboard firefighting side is when we're transporting vehicles on ships. There is no what we call broken stowage space. There's no space between the vehicles. I always tell everybody, imagine a parking deck, and that's like the interior of a car carrier, except that you're not just parking in the spots that are designated. You're parking in every area from the top down. You're bumper to bumper with vehicles. Plus, it's like an underground parking deck because there's no air. I mean, there's no space, there's no nothing. And when you have a fire in a very contained space, especially on board ship, what you start to get is that gas buildup, the smoke buildup happens very quickly. You lose your visibility, and so it becomes a problem. So, what problems then does an EV? And we should note that it doesn't matter if the EV is the cause of the fire or not, because once you have a vehicle fire on board a ship, it's going to spread from vehicle to vehicle. And if you involve an EV in that fire, whether it's the cause for it or it's a secondary ignition, the problem you start to have then is the extinguishment of it. So what would you discuss about the difficulty in extinguishing car fires on board ships? Again, EV or even ice cars.
Well, it really goes back to the systems they use. So my understanding is CO2 is the primary system. You have a method of sealing up that deck, and then you just dump CO2 into the atmosphere, essentially inerting the atmosphere. And that works really well for materials that need oxygen to burn. You get rid of that part of the fire triangle, and that can stop that fire. But for an electric vehicle, we don't need oxygen to burn because the batteries themselves bring their own oxygen. It's a self-oxidizing chemical reaction, and it's a very hot self-oxidizing chemical reaction. So when that's happening, if you try to inert that atmosphere, it's not really going to stop that fire spread. Sure, it's gonna slow things down. It's not going to allow the plastics, the rubbers, the foams to burn, but that heat is still being released, and it's still really heating up the vehicles next to it. And there's only so much CO2 available to flood that deck. Earlier, you mentioned with an EV, you can dump a ton of water, an ocean's worth of water on it, and it's not going to go out. We've had situations down in Hollywood, Florida, for example, a couple of years ago, a Tesla Model X backed into the water. It was trying to launch a jet ski, and it ended up burning underwater for a few hours. And that's just something that you see with electric vehicles because they can burn underwater. That the batteries themselves can burn underwater. So that presents a big challenge. The other side is, people think that you could easily have a crew and get a hose down there and drag it through to the vehicle that's on fire. But that's a extremely dangerous task because of the way those vehicles are parked so closely together, the lack of visibility, but also it's really not practical because of just the number of people on that ship, the number of crew available to fight that fire. So there's a lot of challenges. The other thing that I always find interesting that people always want to recommend is ejecting the vehicle into the water. And if you've ever seen the way these are parked and the way you just described how everything's parked in there, it's almost impossible to get access to the vehicle, let alone get it off of the ship.
Yeah, I mean, we have examples of that too. I mean, in horrific examples of this. I mean, we just had the fire on board a morning Midas out in the Pacific, where we saw that they had a fire. It was involving EVs, and we don't know if it was the cause of it, but we know on the deck that initiated it. We know there were EVs on board that deck, and so it created a initial problem for them. They eventually had to actually abandon the vessel and get off, because they could not fight that fire, and eventually the vessel was lost. We had a fire down in New Jersey, and that was not involved EVs. This was used cars on the Grand Costa d'Avorio, where two Newark firefighters got on board the ship, actually got themselves tangled up in the cars on the car deck, and unfortunately ran out of air and died. And so it is not an area you can go in. I will tell you that even just walking with lights on a car deck on a car carrier is dangerous. I mean, you're going to trip. It's almost impossible to get through, let alone when we're decked out in our gear with hoses and all the equipment we have. And as you said, these ships are running with 22 people on board. And so you have minimal crews on board to fight fires. They're not really paid firefighters, professional firefighters. They go through training, but I mean, they don't do it on a common basis. So outfitting themselves, going on board is a problem. We had an interesting fire recently over in Zeebrugge, which I thought was a really interesting one. This is the motor vessel Delphine. They had a fire on board. Now, they were in port, which helps. Obviously, it helps a lot. They were able to seal the deck. They brought in tugs from the area to provide the cooling on the outside of the hull. One of the big problems you have on a shipboard car fire is you're going to get that radiant heat through the decks, and so it's going to heat up the deck above and below. But they were able to use carbon dioxide to flood the decks and actually bring in nitrogen and actually keep the atmosphere cold and inert until the fire crews could get on board and provide a pretty good overhaul of the area. That brings us to what I wanted to talk about really with you today is the decision by Matson now to basically announce that they are not going to be hauling electrical vehicles on board. So we have this announcement out from Matson talking about the idea that, listen, due to increased concern for the safety of transporting vehicles with large lithium-ion batteries, Matson is suspending acceptance of both used or new electrical vehicles and plug-in hybrids for transport aboard its vessels, and that is effective immediately. And Matson is kind of unique because it provides a almost an exclusive service connecting the United States West Coast to Hawaii. So let's talk a little bit first about what do you think about Matson's decision about not transporting the EVs on board?
Yeah, I think when you look at the risk, we'll start with new vehicles. I would say with a new vehicle, there's very little risk of that vehicle catching on fire while on transport. Uh, the risk isn't zero. There is some risk there, but I'd say the risk is very low. So the decision around that, I does surprise me a little bit. But when you look at some of the incidents that we just talked about, or you just talked about, those were new vehicles. But then when you look at the used vehicle market, there is a lot more risk there because you don't know the history of that vehicle. We've seen vehicles, for example, electric vehicles with flood damage that they've tried to ship. The Port of Miami, they had them in a shipping container and that shipping container exploded because the EV failed. It off-gassed, it built up that atmosphere and then deflagrated, blowing the shipping container apart. So I think when you start talking about used vehicles, you start talking about vehicles that have had recalls on them or they have any type of damage. I think that makes sense. And I could see a lot larger concern when you start talking about that market.
Yeah, and Matson's in a very unique market on the shipping side. They're what we call a Jones Act carrier, so they can only use American-built vessels in the trade connecting the West Coast to Hawaii, and a fire on board any of their vessels would be cataclysmic. I mean, they would lose their vessel. It would take them a long time to replace the vessel, and it would cause a major disruption between the West Coast and Hawaii, and they actually have a connection out to Guam. Two, a lot of these are military people who are deploying over there, so their cars are involved here. So it is going to create a bit of a disruption because there's really not a lot of other alternative for this. The only other exception would be the ability to import electrical vehicles directly into Hawaii from an outside carrier. And the only other carrier that operates any sort of vehicles is Pasha right now, and Pasha hasn't changed their policy, but I would envision that they may follow suit with Matson and change their policy. And that brings us to the idea then, Patrick, is there any safe way to transport EVs? The only concept I came up with was a container concept, is putting them, because like you said, on a car carrier, you can't eject them. I mean, they're packed bumper to bumper down below. You can't even drive them. Maybe putting them on a container on deck. The problem you had is what you just talked about, and you did a great video on this on the container fire down in Miami. Is you had that damaged EV giving off gas, and basically what you had was a bomb on the container there that eventually exploded. Is there anything we've had a lot of notices come out by product carriers about how to safely deal with vehicle fires on board, but it doesn't seem to be right now. We have a technology that allows us to counter an EV fire very effectively on a ship.
Yeah, I don't think we really do. My opinion, the best way to handle that would be going back to just basics, large separation between these vehicles. We'd have to figure out what that distance is. It's probably about 20 feet. But when you start talking about shipping and the cost to ship goods and how much product you can get on a vessel, you want everything nice and tight together. So trying to space those out, that ends up being a problem for the carriers, because now they're losing out. Either they're losing out on money, or they're charging the owner of that EV or whoever's shipping that EV a significant amount of money to get it across. I will say this isn't really a unique issue that we've seen this before. I don't know if you remember back a few years ago in Maui, they had the big wildfires in Lahaina. They had a big issue getting all the damaged batteries off the island. That was another example of they did not want to ship the batteries, because when they went through, they cleaned up all the energy storage systems. They cleaned up all the electric vehicles. They dismantled those batteries. They put them in barrels to ship them off the island, and they had no way of doing it. So they actually had to destroy all those batteries, basically shred them to make them inert to get them off the island. So this is a problem that I think we're going to start seeing we're going to continue to see as we start moving forward with more and more batteries.
Yeah, I mean, when Fremantle Highway, another car carrier, caught fire, this one was up in the North Sea. When they brought her in, they had to get the EVs that were damaged, and I remember them taking them off the vessel, putting them in water tanks just to let them run and make sure that they weren't a problem. Because I've had an issue before where on the back of a mobile car carrier on the road, where we've had a fire before, because you were transporting a damaged EV, and all of a sudden that damaged EV catches fire. What about some of the products that are out there? I mean, every time I ever do a video about this, Patrick, I'll tell you right off the bat, everybody comes out with the idea. So why don't we put fire blankets over them? Why don't we adapt halon back onto the ships? Because that's something that was phased out in the 1990s. Is there a technology out there right now? I agree with you. I think space is probably the best one you could use. Maybe putting just EVs on a certain deck. The problem is that doesn't really work on ships either, because the way you load ships are by decks for destinations. So it's not like you can pull the cars off and then put them back on. That would be really inefficient. And everything we start talking about becomes very inefficient. And when you say inefficient in shipping, that means it gets expensive as crap for everybody. But, thermal blankets, halon, flooding, water flooding. The problem with water flooding on a ship is that's sinking. And we hate putting water, especially high up on a deck, because you start losing stability.
Yeah, the concept of water flooding, would it work? Yeah, because the water would absorb the energy. But like you said, you'd have a lot of other issues at that point. When you start looking at fire blankets, yes, they can help control that propagation from vehicle to vehicle. But you've got a couple things going on. Number one, you're building up a flammable gas underneath that blanket, and you could have a deflagration under that blanket, a very energetic event. And the other side of it is you're adding a lot of weight, and those fire blankets, if you just preemptively cover every vehicle, you're likely going to damage those vehicles in the shipping process. Halon, again, the vehicles don't need oxygen to burn, or the batteries don't need oxygen to burn. So halon's out. It's not going to be effective there. When you start looking at other agents, so there's other people selling different foams, for example. Number one, I'm going to question the effectiveness on the foams that are out there, but you still have to deliver that to the batteries themselves, and getting them inside the battery pack is near impossible. So we're really looking at an impossible task here, trying to get anything to those vehicles to stop those batteries from burning.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that seems, possible, and this is what's being recommended, is early preemptive action by the crew. If you have a fire on board, again, their process is to seal the decks up, which are done anyway. The decks should be sealed. And then by zones, usually a deck or two, cut the ventilation to the area, the inward flow, outward flow, and then flood the deck with carbon dioxide. They have these large liquid CO2 tanks on board, and so they can flood the compartment, and that would tend to isolate it. It would not put the EV, it wouldn't put the battery fire out, but what it could do is prevent that battery fire from engulfing the vehicles and then spreading from vehicle to vehicle. Because what you get is the domino effect, and it runs the risk. And when you look at the images that we have of car carrier fires at sea, what you see is those burn patterns running the deck. You can just literally see them running the deck, and then they run up and down. And eventually what happened in the case of Morning Midas, for example, is those fires engulf the vehicles, the straps, the cloth straps that hold the vehicles in place burn through, the ship rocks from port to starboard, the vehicle shift, the vessel heels over, and then you get a flooding and the vessel goes down. And like you said, it's really tough, especially with Morning Midas in the middle of the Pacific. I mean, it was 1,000 miles from closest point of major port to come to. So it took a week for vessels to get out there, basically. And it's different in port, but like you said, we've seen accidents. Ho Chi Minh down in Jacksonville in 2020. It wounded 9 firefighters down there. We had the death of 2 firefighters on Grand Costa d'Avorio in Newark. And the other experience too, Patrick, with this, I ask you is, how are fire departments preparing to deal with this, both on land and at sea, with fighting these type of electric vehicle fires? Do you feel like there's confidence right now among fire departments to deal with these fires?
Yeah, let me jump back real quick. You just talked about the speed of getting to that fire. And number one, I think any fire in a ship is probably a little bit of a slow process getting to the fire. But when you talk about an electric vehicle fire, one of the things that's pretty crazy about the way they work is everything gets released very quickly. So there's very little warning. So it basically goes from, hey, I've got a vehicle sitting here, nothing's going on, to bam, it's on fire and everything's burning very quickly. Just the way those batteries release their heat. As far as preparations on land, there's a lot of fire departments that still need training around that. That's what I started actually doing back in 2021. I started accompanying. I was traveling around, primarily Michigan at the time, teaching firefighters about electric vehicle fires. And I was doing that part time for about 3 years. And I just recently switched. I've been doing it a year and a half now, full time, traveling around teaching fire departments nationwide about electric vehicles, lithium ion batteries, energy storage. So there's still a big knowledge gap there. There's a lot of firefighters that still need to learn about uh, basically how the batteries work, how to extinguish them, or at least what to do in case of a fire. When you start talking about the shipboard side, I really don't know their level of training, but I would guess they're pretty far back behind the 8 ball on that side of it.
Yeah, it's training on top of training. So I mean, it is not probably their primary. I think car carriers are looking at it more, but you rotate crews. You don't have the same crews on board all the time, and so I agree. I think it's a tough one to deal with, because again, you have a myriad of things, and like you said, being out in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic, 22 people on board, you have that fire. It's going to rapidly spread. And I mean, the best thing you can do is the most you can do is kind of slow it down.
Right.
Is Because extinguishing it is going to be a really tough one. When you look at what happens with Delphine and Zeebrugge, that was fortunate. The ship was in port. There was a lot of assets you can bring to play. And as we've seen, we've lost vessels or had vessels severely damaged, even in port. At Grand Costa d'Avorio, we had a fire on board Bonhomme Richard, a Navy ship, where it started down the vehicle deck. So, I mean, it's very difficult at times to be able to save it. Well, Patrick, I want to thank you for bringing this information to us. It was great. I've been wanting to get you on the show for a while. I'm so happy to get you on. I watch you religiously, but for my viewers, what's the best way to get in touch with you? What are you doing now, so that if fire department is watching us right now and they want to get you down there for some training, how do they get up with you?
Yeah, you can check me out on YouTube, Stash Training, at Stash Training, or my website's www.stachetraining.com. And I provide all sorts of services around lithium ion batteries, electric vehicles, battery energy storage, whether you're a fire department wanting to learn about that side of things, or if you work with those types of systems, I can either do the training or the consulting side. Uh, but I really appreciate you having me on today.
Patrick, I appreciate you coming on with me today. It's great. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and then this story with Matson was a perfect one to get you on. So with that, I want to thank Patrick for being with us today. I want to thank everybody for watching. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support not just my page, but go on over to Stash Training and go support Patrick's page. I strongly recommend. He's got great videos out there. His video on the explosion down in Miami was fantastic. His videos on EV fires in general are really good. Take some time, delve into that. And if you're a local fire department, you need some training on electrical vehicles, hey, I got the guy for you, and it's Patrick. And I have to commend Patrick, too, on his hairstyle selection. I think it's perfect. I think something about firefighters, this is just the way we roll. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, we'll see you next time here on What's Going On with Shipping. This is Sal, signing off.